I always try to figure out, what makes certain brands really stand out. And probably more importantly than just stand out, what makes them stand the test of time? What actually makes them something where people, not only next year, but the next 20 years find important, relevant, and meaningful in their lives?
Welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Just sit back, relax, and learn from the leaders of today. It's a journey. Each one is different, unique, inspiring. Let's get started. 20-Minute Leaders is a proud supporter of Make-A-Wish Israel and Tech to Peace, and is in proud collaboration with Secret Chord Ventures, J Ventures, Riverside FM, Fusion VC, Birthright Excel, J Impact, Leap, Google for Startups, and Hippo, and in media partnership with CTech. Hello and welcome to 20-Minute Leaders. Today we're talking about iconic advantages. Meet Soon Yu, best-selling author of Iconic Advantage and Friction. Soon Yu is a best-selling author and expert on innovation and design. His latest book, Friction, asks businesses to consider adding more friction for their customers and employees to create greater engagement, meaning, belonging, rapport, assurance, competence, and exclusivity. He most recently served as the Global Vice President of Innovation and Officer at VF Corporation, the parent organization to over 30 global apparel companies, including the North Face, Vans, Timberland, Nautica, and Wrangler. Before this, he worked as a general manager at the Clorox company and Chiquita brands, as a consultant in Bain and Company, and as a founder for numerous venture-backed startups. Talking about, your journey, your career, brand creation, differentiation, and all that fun stuff. So we'll have a great conversation over these 20 minutes. You have such an interesting background coming from an electrical engineering, initially Stanford Business School. You were an adjunct professor at Parsons School of Design. Today, a speaker and consultant. So what's sort of been your guide throughout your career? You're making transitions, engineering, brand, identity. What's that been like for you?
Yeah, I've always had, I would consider myself a brand nerd. I've always been interested in the idea that, humans have relationships with different brands. There are certain brands we fall in love with. And if we fall in love with them, I think it's really contingent on those of us who have the responsibility to steward those brands to make sure we don't give any reason for folks to fall out of love with the brands, right? Never give them a reason to be even on the fence with the brands. And even when I was in high school, I had this curiosity about brands and products and the relationships that I actually have with humans. And so as an engineer, I came at it from really how do you design and build them. But I was also very interested in the idea that it went beyond the actual physical product to a relationship. And so I think for most of my career, I've been, going from this idea of understanding how to make the products, but then once the products or services are created, what's the relationships that are created by the interactions and by the experiences? And so I think most of my journey has been around trying to basically unpack that, understand that, write a little bit about that, talk about that, and continuously meet new people like yourself. And in meeting people like yourself, I always learn something new. And so that's what makes it fun and exciting.
So tell me a little bit about product and brand creation. What is the complexity around that really made you curious, or something that's worth investigating further?
Sure. Actually, one of the most areas that had the highest curiosity was around apparel and fashion. It was interesting that a product such as a shirt, right? And depending on the color of the shirt, how it's cut, the design of it, the style, it can make the same person feel differently about themselves, depending on if they were wearing a different color or if they were wearing a different style shirt. And that was always something that drove my curiosity. This idea of fashion and design and how that would impact the idea of how brands are created in people's minds. And so, I was always interested in what creates this idea that, depending if you're driving a I don't know, let's drive your Honda versus you're driving a same car, same size, but it happens just to have a Porsche symbol on it, right? and it has a 911 on it. You feel very differently about maybe even yourself as you drive it, about the product, and even how people you think even how people perceive you when you're actually using two different products. So yeah, I always trying to figure out what makes certain brands really stand out, and probably more importantly than just stand out, what makes them stand the test of time? What actually makes them something where people, not only next year, but the next 20 years find important, relevant, and meaningful in their lives? And so my first book, actually, Iconic Advantage, was really looking at how brands really stood the test of time, and not only stood the test of time, stood for something different and meaningful that made them become the standard bearer for whatever that, call it, meaningful distinction was, and with longevity, become iconic for that point of distinction. So, I was always very curious about how brands did that, and how products did that, and how services did that. And so, that's sort of the journey that I've been on.
And so if we're looking at the challenge of creating a standard, right? You mentioned that is a part of the strength of brand creation, which speaks to longevity. It speaks to really defining leadership within a category. What does it really take to become a standard? And ultimately, what differentiates a good brand from one that manages to sort of win this game and reach that standardization point?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we looked at 50 different companies that had portfolios of iconic products and services, and by having those iconic products and services, they became iconic brands, them and themselves. And we found three distinguishing qualities that all of them shared. And the first one, you kind of mentioned it. It's this idea of distinction. There's something that makes them stand out versus the competition, something that if you and I were to talk about that brand, we would give them credit for, something that they would actually uniquely own. And so that was sort of the first quality that we saw, is that all of them had this idea of distinction and differentiation. The second one was very important, and it wasn't that they weren't just different for different sake. It was whatever they were distinctive for was highly relevant and meaningful to the audience that they wanted to become iconic to. And what was important about this idea of relevance wasn't that it wasn't just a point in time. It wasn't just yesterday. It was this idea that they were going to be relevant yesterday, today, and tomorrow. They had this ability to have sort of this timeless relevance. And then lastly, within the audience they wanted to be iconic for, they were universally recognized for that distinctive relevance. And that's what allowed them to really become iconic.
If we're looking now from the get-go, you know what? Try to piece together from an entrepreneur perspective. You're building a brand, and how intentional do you need to be, and at what stages, as you're trying to build an iconic brand? In other words, where does strategy play into your intentionality or the actions you need to take in order to become an iconic brand? Is this something that you need to build from the get-go? Is this something that you need to that eventually you start thinking about as you see that you're getting traction? How early on do you need to be, cognizant of this?
Yeah, I work with a lot of startups, and most of them say, look, I'm just trying to survive. I'm trying to get to the next round of funding. I'm just trying to build my MVP. And I fully appreciate that. And obviously you have to sequence your priorities. And if the sequence is I need to just, build a minimal viable product, then do that. But once you've gotten a certain amount of traction, once you actually have customers, then I do think the intentional strategy of thinking about how do I create something that goes beyond the best technology or the fastest or the largest. I always tell startups that I work with that it's not the biggest or the fastest or the most bells and whistles or most technologically gifted mousetrap that gets the mice. It's the one with the stinkiest cheese. So even from the get-go, I ask brands to think about, what's your stinky cheese? What makes you, I guess, smell more fragrant, to attract mice? when you don't have to have the best mousetrap. And so if you can create stinky cheese, which oftentimes is a point of distinction, that you have a great story that's very relevant to your audience, and your storytelling around that allows you to create that fragrance. So I always talk about it with startups. Don't just worry about trying to be the biggest or the fastest or the most bells and whistles. Really think about, how do you actually stand out in terms of how you talk about it and how you share it and how people actually experience it.
Yeah. So what's been a differentiating factor for in the storytelling side of things and the stinkiness? What's been separating the good from the excellent?
Sure. So a couple pieces of advice about that. I find that a lot of startups and a lot of new businesses try to be everything to everybody. Okay. And I think what happens with that is there's a lot of dilution, right? You try to create a point of distinction, and you try to make it differentiated with as big of audience as possible. And in reality, you don't have the marketing muscle, you don't have the presence, you don't have the testimonials to really own everything with everybody. What I always recommend is have one thing that really makes you unique versus your competition. Make it your signature and own it with 4 people. Literally with 4 people. Do it really well with those 4 or 5 people. And guess what? They will then become testimonials for you. They'll become converts and evangelists and be able to talk about whatever that point of distinction is that you do so well with those 4 people or 5 people, that then it becomes and builds a groundswell. But I think the biggest trap is when everyone says, look, either I've got to be different for different sake, or I want to be everything to everybody. And I don't think that really works well. I think it's much more important to have 1,000 people that love you versus having 1 million people that know you.
Right. And so for companies that are looking at a blue ocean and they're trying to say, okay, there's this blue ocean here that I want to become potentially a market leader in because I have a thesis on some problem space and some innovative approach that I can bring to an emerging problem. And I realize that there's a potential to become a market leader. How do you balance between sort of the smaller distinction? Okay, these are the 10 people that I'm going to make them love me. How do you compensate for that within a larger strategy for how do I become in 2-3 years somebody that not only these 10 people love, but also these other 1,000 people who have different needs and wants they also love? So how do you balance a long-term strategy for market leadership versus sort of the shorter-term strategy of making these specific people love you?
Yeah. See, I think you're bringing up what I would consider a normal question that most business leaders reach when they get to a certain scale. And so you're asking a very, what I call, common sense question, like how do you balance that? I actually think it's misleading in that, I'll take an example. I used to work at VF Corp, which is a large apparel company, and it owns 30 different brands. But one of the brands it owns is a very important brand, the North Face, right? It's a leader in its category in terms of outdoor wear. And this was maybe 15 years ago. We were looking at the market, and at that point, we thought, oh, maybe, we need to appeal to more people. And what we learned in all our work, in all our analysis, is that if we lose our focus on the 2 or 3% that are, climbing Mount Everest, that are always climbing the 7 peaks and always trying to, we call them, the hardcore explorers, right? If we lose our focus on those folks, then everything else we did throughout the entire product line was diluted. And if anything, we decided that we're going to double down on making sure that no matter what we did, we always service those 1 or 2% that were going to be climbing Mount Everest. If you knew that the Sherpas and everyone that's going to Everest use primarily the North Face sleeping bags and jackets and all the equipment, right? Then guess what? It halos everything else you're doing. So I think the same point applies to your question, which is, by actually making call it that 1%, extremely happy, okay? And maybe over-indexing in terms of delivering satisfaction and product functionality and innovation to them, it halos the other 99% because they end up serving as sort of a torture test and probably the best evangelists and testimonials you're going to get from the other 99% of the people, which quite frankly don't matter as much. And so that's why I say, man, nail that 1%, nail it and continually nail it, meaning that you should have an innovation pipeline that every year is bringing new innovation, new story, new design to that 1% that delights them, and they will talk about it, and it will halo to the other 99%.
Love it. Love it. Where's your personal passion and excitement for brand creation and iconic brands? Where's that coming from these days?
Well, I think it started off early as a child. I always loved products. I loved, and then, obviously we were much more a product economy when I was young, and now it's much more of a service economy. And I think, where is it coming from today is the same place that it came from when I was a kid. It comes from this idea that, I've always been a nerd about the idea of relationships. And so, I have some brands that I've fallen in love with all my whole life. And I don't want to ever have a reason not to have a relationship with those brands. And so I work with a lot of companies that I really have a great respect for the brand that they've created. And for some reason, they've fallen off on the wayside. And I'm like, I don't want to have a reason not to have a relationship with this brand in the next 5 to 10 years. And so that's the motivation, is that, like your best friends, right? You don't want to lose your best friends. All right. And I feel the same way about the brands that I have strong relationships with. Is I don't want to feel like I have to swap out a new best friend every 2 years. It's exhausting, and I don't think it's necessary. And so, yeah, I'd rather have fewer, deeper, meaningful relationships with both friends, but also with my brands.
Interesting. Have you identified that the strategy or the relationship with brands has evolved over the last maybe couple decades, with different engagements from Generation Z, the way that trust is changing in our community? What's been changing in terms of, brand strategy on a higher level over these last few years?
Yeah, I think couple of things have happened. Obviously, with the technology, with the consumers, call it involvement and engagement and ability to have voice on the brand relationship, and both of those accelerating what I call the pace of both brand creation and adoption, but also brand, let's say, termination, right? In terms of I can swap out a brand very easily now with another brand, right? Mm-hmm. That presents new challenges for those of us who are brand stewards. And so I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges is the disposability of brands and the creation and the so-called the quick creation of new brands. In that type of climate, I think it's even more important not to lose focus on that 1%, right? The 1% that you really need to speak to. Because if you speak to them and you speak to them better than anybody else, that 1%'s voice has influence over the other 99%. But I feel like a lot of brands lose sight of that, and they start chasing shiny new objects. They start chasing sort of new customer bases because they are on the need for growth, or they're being challenged at their left flank and their right flank, and they're so worried about those that they lose focus on where they are already strong, where they already have a base, where they already have traction. And so a lot of times I challenge brands and I said, don't always chase the new, innovate the old, innovate where you're already strong, innovate where you already have great customers and consumers who love you, innovate where you already have supply chain strength and where you already, have distribution and where you already have your marketing dollars go farther than other people, instead of trying to always worry about what's new and what's coming at you.
Right. Now that makes a lot of sense. And so final tip for young entrepreneurs that are just starting their journey. And regardless if they're going for a big brand, small brand, they're trying to create trust with their customers. What is an exercise that you would encourage a young entrepreneur to do with themselves, with their team, as they're thinking about what they're representing in their company? What is something that you recommend to your friends and your clients to do?
Yeah, I think there's a simple exercise. You can actually do it on a very personal level with respect to, yourself and your career and how you show up against your peers. You can obviously do it with your product services and the brand that you're managing, no matter the size of it. And it's this. You need to answer this question. What's your signature? What's the one thing that if I pulled 3 of your customers, okay, that's all. I just need 3 of your customers, that they would say that one would be the same thing, okay? They would consistently say the same thing. And then 2, it would be something that is actually truly yours and ownable versus any competitor could actually say the same thing. So if you can actually have one signature, like if 99 out of 100 people that have met you, get to know you from a business perspective, said, this is the guru of the 20-minute leader. Okay. I mean, that is who you are. It's your signature. You own it. And, both the 20-minute, the leader, that part of it is embodied in everything Michael does. Okay. Which is fantastic. So whatever it is on a personal level and then on a professional level and in the work that you're doing and the brands that you manage, what is your signature? 10 people, if I brought 3 people together, one, would they all say the same thing? Okay. That's the first test. Would what they say not only be the same thing, but it would be something that they actually thought was meaningful to them and something they cared about. And then 3, it's something that none of your competitors could say. If you can pass those 3 tests with 3 of your customers or 3 of your friends, then guess what? You have something that is going to stick, that's going to last, that you're going to invest against, that will have huge dividends in terms of making you stand out and making you ownable.
Amazing. Soon, thank you so much for the time, the energy. I learned so much, and this conversation is leaving me with thoughts and with more energized to now think about whatever brands I get to work on, whatever brands my friends are getting to work on, and a new lens of thinking about this idea of being an iconic brand and creating and playing the game. So thank you very, very much. This was so nice, and I look forward to continue keeping in touch and getting advice from you around whatever brands I get to create. So thank you.
Wonderful, Michael. Thank you.